Picture this. It's the year 897 AD in Rome. Inside the papal basilica, a courtroom has been assembled. The defendant sits slumped in the dock, dressed in papal robes, silent and motionless. This isn't unusual for a medieval trial, except for one horrifying detail. The defendant has been dead for 9 months. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod, perhaps the most bizarre trial in human history, where a pope's rotting corpse was exhumed, dressed, and put on trial for crimes against the church. It's a tale that sounds too strange to be true, yet it really happened in the dark corridors of medieval Rome. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We'd love to see how far this story is reaching. If you enjoy dark corners of history, the stories they never told us in school, consider subscribing. It really helps us keep these strange stories alive. To understand how a dead pope ended up on trial, we need to step into the chaos of 9th century Rome. This was an era historians call the Dark Age of the Papacy, and for good reason. The papal throne had become a prize fought over by Italian noble families, each seeking to control the spiritual and political heart of Western Christianity. Popes were made and unmade with frightening regularity. Some reigned for decades, others barely lasted months before meeting violent ends. The Holy Roman Empire was fracturing. Local strongmen carved out territories, and the line between sacred and secular power had become dangerously blurred. In this world, the Pope wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a political kingmaker who could crown emperors and legitimize dynasties. Rome itself was a shadow of its former glory. The great city had shrunk to perhaps 30,000 inhabitants, huddled among the ruins of ancient grandeur. Political violence was common, and papal elections often resembled gang warfare more than sacred ceremonies. Into this volatile mix came ambitious men who saw the papacy as the ultimate prize. They would stop at nothing to claim it, not even desecrating the grave of a predecessor. This was the world that would witness one of history's most macabre spectacles, the trial of Pope Formosus, 9 months after his death. Formosus wasn't born to be pope, but he was certainly born to be a politician. Rising through the church hierarchy in the mid-800s, he caught the attention of Pope Nicholas I, who recognized his diplomatic skills and sharp intellect. By 864, Formosus had been appointed Bishop of Porto, a prestigious position that put him in the inner circle of papal power. But his real talent lay in international diplomacy. He was sent on crucial missions across Europe, to Bulgaria, to France, to the fractured kingdoms of the former Carolingian Empire. However, Formosus's political maneuvering would eventually make him powerful enemies. In 876, he was accused of abandoning his diocese and plotting to become pope himself. The charges were serious enough that he was excommunicated and forced into exile. For 5 years, he lived as a political refugee, his career seemingly over. But Rome's politics were nothing if not fluid. In 878, a new pope reversed Formosus's excommunication, and he was restored to his position. When Pope Marinus III died in 884, the Roman clergy and nobility chose Formosus as their new leader. His papacy, lasting from 891 to 896, was marked by the same bitter political divisions that plagued all of 9th century Rome. Formosus crowned Lambert of Spoleto as Holy Roman Emperor, then later switched allegiance to Arnulf of Carinthia, a decision that would have deadly consequences even after his natural death in 896. Formosus died peacefully in his bed, having served as pope for 5 years. He was buried with full honors in St. Peter's Basilica. He had no idea that his troubles were just beginning. When Formosus died in April 896, the papal throne didn't remain empty for long. After a brief interregnum, Stephen VI ascended to power, and he came with a burning hatred for his predecessor. Stephen VI's rise to the papacy was backed by the powerful Spoleto family, specifically Guy IV of Spoleto and his son Lambert. These were the same nobles Formosus had initially supported before switching sides to crown Arnulf of Carinthia as emperor. In medieval politics, such betrayals were rarely forgotten or forgiven. The Spoletos saw Formosus's actions as not just politically damaging, but spiritually illegitimate. If they could prove that Formosus had been an invalid pope, then all his papal acts, including the crowning of their rival Arnulf, would be null and void. Lambert's claim to the imperial throne would be restored. But Stephen VI's motivations went beyond mere political calculation. Contemporary sources suggest he harbored a personal, almost obsessive hatred for Formosus. Perhaps he genuinely believed Formosus had corrupted the papal office. Or perhaps he was simply a man consumed by ambition, willing to desecrate the dead to secure his own power. The idea that would become the Cadaver Synod likely emerged in late 896 or early 897. It was audacious beyond belief to put a dead pope on trial for his alleged crimes. Yet, in the violent, unstable world of 9th century Rome, even the most bizarre schemes could find supporters. Stephen VI began gathering allies among the Roman clergy and nobility. He framed his planned trial not as vindictive politics, but as a necessary purification of the Church. The dead Formosus, he claimed, had committed crimes that demanded posthumous justice. In January 897, 9 months after Formosus's peaceful death, Stephen VI ordered the unthinkable. Papal guards were dispatched to St. Peter's Basilica with shovels and crowbars. The tomb of Pope Formosus was cracked open, and his decomposing body was dragged from its resting place. What happened next defies belief, even by the standards of medieval Europe. The corpse was dressed in full papal vestments, the sacred robes Formosus had worn in life. The body was then propped up in a chair in the papal court, positioned to face Stephen VI and the assembled judges. A deacon was appointed to speak for the dead pope, creating a grotesque parody of legal proceedings. The charges against Formosus were read aloud: that he had been ambitious for the papacy while serving as Bishop of Porto, that he had violated canon law by moving from one diocese to another, and that he had crowned Arnulf as emperor illegitimately. The trial proceeded with all the formal trappings of medieval justice, except for the silent, rotting defendant slumped in his chair. Witnesses testified against Formosus. Evidence was presented. The deacon, speaking for the dead pope, could offer only feeble denials. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe the scene. One wrote that the very air in the courtroom seemed cursed, thick with the stench of decay and the weight of sacrilege. Another noted that even hardened Roman nobles accustomed to violence and political cruelty seemed disturbed by what they were witnessing. The trial lasted several days, a macabre theater that shocked even the jaded politics of 9th century Rome. But its outcome was never in doubt. Stephen VI had not exhumed his predecessor to acquit him. The verdict of the Cadaver Synod was as predetermined as it was devastating. Pope Formosus was found guilty on all charges. His papacy was declared null and void, retroactively erasing 5 years of papal history. But Stephen VI's vengeance didn't end with a simple guilty verdict. In a final act of desecration, he ordered that 3 fingers be cut from Formosus's right hand, the same fingers used for papal blessings. The corpse was then stripped of its papal vestments and redressed in the simple robes of a layman. The mutilated body was initially buried in a cemetery for foreigners, as if Formosus had never been Roman, never been pope. But even this wasn't enough for Stephen VI. Within days, he ordered the corpse exhumed again and thrown into the Tiber River. According to legend, a monk fishing in the Tiber discovered the body and, recognizing the distinctive papal ring still on the corpse's finger, secretly reburied Formosus with proper Christian rites. Whether this story is true or later pious fiction, it speaks to the horror many Romans felt at Stephen VI's actions. The political consequences were immediate and severe. All of Formosus's papal acts were invalidated. Ordinations he had performed were declared void, bishops he had appointed were deposed, and most importantly for Stephen VI's backers, Arnulf's imperial coronation was erased from history. Yet the Cadaver Synod would prove to be Stephen VI's greatest mistake. In trying to eliminate his predecessor's legacy, he had committed an act so shocking that it would ultimately destroy his own papacy and legacy. Hey, if you're finding this story as fascinating and disturbing as we are, consider hitting that subscribe button. These dark chapters of history deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us bring them to light. The immediate aftermath of the Cadaver Synod revealed just how badly Stephen VI had miscalculated. While he may have satisfied his political backers, he had horrified ordinary Romans and much of the clergy. Medieval people, despite living in violent times, held deep reverence for the dead and for the sanctity of Christian burial. The idea of exhuming a pope, any pope, and subjecting his corpse to trial and mutilation struck at the core of their religious beliefs. Popular unrest began almost immediately. Romans who had perhaps been indifferent to the political maneuvering between popes were outraged by what they saw as sacrilege. Street protests erupted, with crowds demanding Stephen VI's removal from the papal throne. Even more damaging was the reaction of the Roman clergy. Many bishops and priests who had initially supported Stephen VI began to distance themselves from his regime. Some openly questioned whether a pope who could commit such acts was truly chosen by God. The political winds were also shifting. Arnulf of Carinthia, despite having his imperial coronation invalidated, remained a powerful force in Italian politics. His supporters in Rome began working to undermine Stephen VI's authority. By summer 897, just months after the Cadaver Synod, Stephen VI's position had become untenable. A conspiracy formed among Roman nobles and clergy, united by their disgust at the Pope's actions and their desire for political change. In August 897, the inevitable happened. Stephen VI was deposed, arrested, and thrown into prison. His fate mirrored that of many medieval popes who fell from power. He was strangled in his cell, likely on the orders of his political enemies. The man who had orchestrated history's most bizarre trial had himself become a victim of Rome's brutal politics, dying less than a year after desecrating his predecessor's grave. For over 1,000 years, historians have struggled to make sense of the Cadaver Synod. How could such a bizarre event have occurred in the heart of Christendom? What does it tell us about medieval society and the medieval church? Some historians view it primarily as political theater, a calculated move by Stephen VI and his backers to legitimize their hold on power. By destroying Formosus's papal legacy, they could rewrite recent history to their advantage. The grotesque spectacle in this interpretation was simply the price of political necessity in a violent age. Others see it as evidence of deeper spiritual crisis within the medieval church. The rapid succession of popes, the constant political interference, and the general corruption of church offices had created a situation where normal moral restraints had broken down. The Cadaver Synod becomes not an aberration, but a symptom of institutional decay. A few historians have suggested that Stephen VI may have been genuinely mentally unstable, driven by obsessive hatred to commit acts that shocked even his own supporters. The intensity of his vendetta against Formosus, they argue, suggests pathological rather than merely political motivations. What's remarkable is how quickly the medieval church tried to suppress memory of the Cadaver Synod. Subsequent popes reversed Stephen VI's decrees, restored Formosus's papal status, and tried to pretend the whole episode had never happened. Official church histories from the period barely mention it, treating it as an embarrassing aberration. Yet the story survived in chronicles and popular memory, too shocking and strange to be completely forgotten. Medieval writers seem to understand that they were recording something unprecedented in church history, a moment when the normal boundaries of law, politics, and sacred tradition had collapsed entirely. Modern historians continue to debate its significance, but all agree on one point. The Cadaver Synod represents one of the most extraordinary moments in the long, often dark history of the medieval papacy. For over 1,000 years, historians have struggled to make sense of the Cadaver Synod. How could such a bizarre event have occurred in the heart of Christendom? What does it tell us about medieval society and the medieval church? Some historians view it primarily as political theater, a calculated move by Stephen VI and his backers to legitimize their hold on power. By destroying Formosus's papal legacy, they could rewrite recent history to their advantage. The grotesque spectacle in this interpretation was simply the price of political necessity in a violent age. Others see it as evidence of deeper spiritual crisis within the medieval church. The rapid succession of popes, the constant political interference, and the general corruption of church offices had created a situation where normal moral restraints had broken down. The Cadaver Synod becomes not an aberration, but a symptom of institutional decay. A few historians have suggested that Stephen VI may have been genuinely mentally unstable, driven by obsessive hatred to commit acts that shocked even his own supporters. The intensity of his vendetta against Formosus, they argue, suggests pathological rather than merely political motivations. What's remarkable is how quickly the medieval church tried to suppress memory of the Cadaver Synod. Subsequent popes reversed Stephen VI's decrees, restored Formosus's papal status, and tried to pretend the whole episode had never happened. Official church histories from the period barely mention it, treating it as an embarrassing aberration. Yet the story survived in chronicles and popular memory. Too shocking and strange to be completely forgotten, medieval writers seemed to understand that they were recording something unprecedented in church history. a moment when the normal boundaries of law, politics, and sacred tradition had collapsed entirely. Modern historians continue to debate its significance, but all agree on one point. The Cadaver Synod represents one of the most extraordinary moments in the long, often dark history of the medieval papacy. More than 11 centuries later, the Cadaver Synod remains one of history's most bizarre legal proceedings. It stands as a stark reminder of how political power can corrupt even the most sacred institutions, and how the pursuit of legitimacy can lead to acts that ultimately delegitimize everything they touch. The trial of Pope Formosus reveals the medieval world at its most unstable, a time when the line between the sacred and the political had become dangerously blurred. In trying to erase his predecessor's legacy, Stephen VI had only succeeded in creating his own dark legacy, one that would outlast any political advantage he might have gained. Perhaps most striking is how the Cadaver Synod demonstrates the universal human need for justice and closure, even when taken to grotesque extremes. Stephen VI couldn't simply defeat his political enemies. He needed to prove they had been wrong all along, even if it meant putting a corpse on trial. The story also reveals the power of public opinion in medieval society. Despite living in an age of authoritarian rule, ordinary Romans still had the power to bring down a pope whose actions crossed fundamental moral boundaries. Their revulsion at the desecration of Formosus's body ultimately proved more powerful than Stephen VI's political backing. Today, the Cadaver Synod serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of political extremism and the importance of respecting both the dead and the institutions that bind society together. It reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, there are lines that, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. The strange trial of Pope Formosus has earned its place in history not because it achieved its political goals, it didn't, but because it represents something deeper about human nature, power, and the sometimes fine line between justice and vengeance. So there you have it, one of history's strangest trials, a story that really did happen in the heart of medieval Rome. What do you think about this bizarre chapter of church history? And once again, where in the world are you watching from? We love seeing how far these forgotten stories can travel. If you enjoyed diving into this dark corner of history, make sure to subscribe to Quick Historians for more stories they never taught us in school. Until next time, keep exploring the strange and fascinating world of our past.